This tutorial is about Karl Marx and his capitalism problems. So it bears reminding that socialism is really born out of a critique of capitalism. It comes from the Industrial Revolution's growing income inequality and exploitation and hardship. But Marx is not the only one that critiques capitalism. In fact, Adam Smith, the father of free markets, admitted that free markets would often fail and need government intervention to actively promote against monopoly, for instance. Marx, as well as Thomas Robert Malthus, believed they were unstable, free markets. The utopian socialists, the early socialists, believed them to be unfair and immoral and didn't have a whole lot more to say about what we should do instead, and actually neither does Marx. But he's got more of a start. David Ricardo, the person that brought us the idea of comparative advantage, admitted that people with power, like landowners, would be increasing their incomes over time. There would be growing inequality and rewarding of unproductive resources simply because some resources are scarce compared to everything else. So there's a lot of different, from different corners, critiques of capitalism. Moreover, we could argue that capitalism does not necessarily reward resources according to society's preferences or in a way that necessarily is sustainable and creates long-term economic growth. There's nothing to guarantee that society's preferences and consumer choices will be good. We may be purchasing porn and Cheetos primarily, and that's probably not a sustainable society. And then we can question the assumptions about human behavior. Robert Owen, a utopian socialist, had some good points about motivation. What do factory owners and employers believe to be true about human motivation? And do people like work? What motivates us to work? Is it simply cash? Is it something else? Is it meaning? Is it finding value and fitting in and contributing to the world? And then further critiques can be offered up by behavioral economists who focus on errors in human rationality or errors in human choice, where we do things that end up hurting us. So Marx will add to everything else his assertion that capitalism is unnatural, unkind, it's built on theft, it's unstable, and it's doomed. So I've already mentioned that the Industrial Revolution is where modern socialism has its roots, primarily out of protesting the exploitation of workers. What we have going on in the Industrial Revolution is low wages, dangerous working conditions, unemployment, and the beginning of recurring recessions. Now that we are talking about industrial society rather than agricultural society, the recessions tend to be more of a thing, right? Not too many times, except in drought and other sort of large-scale natural disasters, have we seen a whole economy or whole society be brought low. Well, this is happening in industrial society, and there's lots of theories about why, but certainly part of it is the interconnectedness of all the different parts of the economy. Industrial production is a very complex type of production, so you have the textile factory dependent on all sorts of downstream and upstream. People are depending on them, they're depending on others, and when one sort of gear in the machine breaks, the whole machine can break. So we're going to call Karl Marx a fusion chef, because like Adam Smith, he is an integrator of some common schools of thought existing during their day, and they mix them together to be sort of more than the whole. So it's not that they're necessarily the inventor of the ideas, but they're the mixologist putting together the ideas in a new way that ends up being much more powerful than the individual pieces. So Marx's integration of three popular schools of thought are Hegel's dialectic in German political philosophy, the idea of class warfare from the French Revolution, and British political economy. And this is where perhaps his weakest arguments lie and have been more debunked than others, and that is the labor theory of value. That before some supply and demand curves, we're trying to figure out what makes the value of a thing in the market be that specific price. And the idea was that that value is determined by the amount of labor time needed to produce it. So if a desk takes 2 hours of labor to make and a stool takes only 1 hour of labor to make, we should expect that the desk would sell for twice as much as the stool. But this raises some questions like, why do some brands of stools that have just as much labor in them sell for much more than others? What about brand preferences, etc.? What about, there's a lot of different ways you can critique the labor theory of value. And in this mix that Karl Marx is making in his Fusion Kitchen, he also uses the philosophical basis, we should note, of materialism. So materialists would think about the economic forces shaping realities rather than other forces. So he argues that the institutions of an economy or a society, like religion, politics, philosophy, etc., would follow economic patterns. Whatever means of production is important will become a tool of power. For instance, where horses are the main tool for warfare or way to distribute and bring goods from one spot to another, those that own horses are going to have more power. Those that are successful breeders of horses will have more power. They will probably try to prevent other people from breeding horses, etc. And Karl Marx then is talking a lot about conflict here, how those that have the horses, whatever the class that has that power, is going to want to preserve that power, and class conflict will necessarily be sort of what drives struggle and what drives change. So communism is what happens when humans advance beyond those power struggles. To summarize this dialectical materialism, right, the dialectic would be that struggle, two forces struggling together, coming to sort of a synthesis at the end of that struggle. And the struggle for him is class struggle between owners and the class that does not own. So the controlling class or the owners are the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class, right, the factory owners. And the exploited class here is the proletariat, the working class. They own only their own labor. Note that you will have your owning class or your ruling class find interesting ways to preserve their position. So whether that's through politics, religion, Marx does call religion the opiate of the masses because it helps keep down the oppressed. But eventually, this would fail. So the mechanism by which capitalism fails is this built-in exploitation and systemic failure. And here Marx is very astute and early critic of capitalism, especially the instability of capitalism. So he bases much of his model on the now sort of ridiculed labor theory of value, but that's where economics was during his day. So the labor theory of value is about labor, and that the value of a product is really related based on its labor. So labor is the common denominator of all goods produced. And secondly, he's going to add subsistence wage theory. So this is important when we talk about how wages are set. So his idea is that the natural wage rate would be whatever is required for basic survival. Because people are disempowered during the Industrial Revolution and they're terrified of being abandoned by employers, they accept a lower wage rate to the point that they can't accept anything lower. In other words, you need to at least be able to pay for food to live. You won't accept something below the cost of your food or the cost of your upkeep, basically. So again, this power difference is important. We have a huge population growth. We've got lots of factories and owners of factories, but really no unions, no worker empowerment whatsoever. And the employers sort of hold all the cards. So we're seeing really low wage rates in the Industrial Revolution, subsistence. So much so that workers really can't afford enough food or heat or anything to keep their families from starvation very often, or at least from very high infant mortality. So let's talk about what profit is. Where does profit come from? This is an interesting question. Many people have asked over time. And in Marx's view, profit is the same as primitive accumulation. So he would call it surplus value, and the surplus value is whatever the firm is receiving in revenue minus the cost of production, whatever's left over. And for Marx, the value of a good, what it sells for in the market, is the cost of the raw materials and capital, the wages, so C plus V basically are your total cost of production, and then whatever's left is that S, that surplus value, that what goes to the capitalist. Now remember that C represents stored up labor, so capital is sure we're using machines in the production process, but other workers made those machines. So there's this embedded labor in all of those machines. And you could think of the ratio S over V as the amount of exploitation. And for Marx, it really is exploitation. The workers are making something, and then the capitalists are selling it for a higher value and keeping the value, the profit for themselves, or Marx would call the surplus value for themselves. And that's simply because they own the scarce resource called the factors of production. They own the factories that workers are competing with each other to get jobs at. And because there aren't, enough good jobs, these factory owners sort of use their position of monopoly power to extract profit from workers. Workers who, remember, will accept very low wages, subsistence level wages. So that exploitation is what has Marx angry. So putting this all together, here's how capitalism is unstable. Workers are only paid enough to buy a portion of the total output, right? They have subsistence level wages, they can't afford to buy much, and the rest goes to capitalists or factory owners. And the capitalists do spend, but a portion goes to replacement of capital, and this is variable, and savings do increase as profits and sales rise over time, and consumption decreases, and firms will experience inventory buildups, unsold output, losses. Eventually, some of them, the weaker ones, will go bankrupt. Then we get falling prices and unemployment. And over time, these crises will worsen. So each crisis makes some firms disappear. The firms that are left are more able then to use their monopoly power and extract more profit from workers. And they are motivated to compete with each other as well. And so they, in this age of technological revolution, they will innovate, adopt new machines, etc. And machines are throwing workers out of work in the Industrial Revolution. But since labor is a source of all value, this means there's less surplus value over time and more fodder for exploitation, more viciousness. Eventually, the proletariat revolts to socialism, which will give way to communism. And basically this problem of the reserve army of the unemployed. You're going to get more and more unemployment as machines and recessions increase, and the world is ripe for revolution.